We're going to start talking about ethical theories, and we're going to start that by talking about consequentialist theories. Because I think these tend to be a little bit easier to understand, and so they can kind of serve as a framework to help us understand the other ethical theories that we're going to be talking about. Now, even consequentialist theories are not necessarily like straightforward or easy to understand. They're easier, but there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of different kinds of consequentialist theories. It's genuinely a huge topic. So we're going to have to start just by kind of narrowing down the different views that we're going to be talking about in this module. So let's get started. Let's start by talking about what an ethical theory even is. And to do this, I want to try to draw a comparison to scientific theories. Not because I think we're doing like science or anything like that, but just they do play a similar role, right? If you think about what a scientific law is, a lot of people misunderstand like laws and theories. A scientific law is just like a description about like the way the world works, you know, like the law of gravity or whatever, that just describes how objects move in relation to one another. A scientific theory, though, tries to explain why that kind of thing happens. So you'd have a law of gravity and then a theory of gravity that tries to explain why objects, with mass are attracted towards one another. An ethical theory is similar to that because, again, it's trying to answer a why question. We're trying to explain why something is morally right or morally wrong. And so that's the fundamental thing to keep in mind. We already have like pretty good intuitions about right and wrong. I know that like drop kicking a baby is not going to be okay. So what we want from a good ethical theory is first off to line up with those intuitions, to sort of get the cases right. And in cases where they don't line up with our intuitions, to at least give some kind of good story as to why our intuitions might have been mistaken. And then we want it to help guide us in sort of the non-obvious cases, the ones like, euthanasia or abortion or whatever that there's not a whole lot of widespread agreement on. So what we're talking about here, we've got an ethical theory, and we'll see a challenge to this later, but an ethical theory needs to be sort of normatively explainable, right? It needs to explain these normative facts. Why shouldn't you do that? Or why should you do this? What are the morally relevant features that are going on there? So consequentialist theories are an approach to try to answer that question. Now, technically speaking, consequentialism is not an ethical theory. Technically, consequentialism is just what's called a criterion of right. It's basically just saying that, like, look, the right act is the one that kind of brings about the best consequences. And so the different consequentialist theories then, that's what they kind of all have in common, is that they are all looking at the outcome, or better, the expected outcome of some particular action or motive or intent or whatever. And that's how they're going to go about evaluating that kind of thing. So consequentialism is like this big umbrella term under which a bunch of different ethical theories will fall. But this is a really nice way of thinking about ethical theories. And in fact, you can kind of use this framework to construct an ethical theory. And so just very broadly what we have, so we'll need to start with some kind of criterion of right. And, for consequentialist theories in general, the right act is the one that's going to bring about the most good. Now, good in this course doesn't mean good. Good means valuable. Almost all the time, good means valuable. And so really what we're talking about here is, for a consequentialist theory, we want it to bring about stuff that we care about, stuff that is valuable. That's why we need a theory of value. And then we'll also need a way to decide what the right action is. Now, rather than just leave this sort of like kind of ambiguous with a bunch of like weird sort of hard to get at definitions, let's try and like put this on the ground here and get an actual ethical theory in front of us. Now, just real quick, when we're talking about a theory of value, what we're looking at is what ethicists tend to call like intrinsic value. Some might call it inherent value. Basically, the idea is that this is the kind of value that something has for its own sake. It's contrasted with instrumental value. This is the value that something has for the sake of something else. So a standard example somebody, might give is money. Like, why do you care about money? Well, for me at least, I can use money to buy new video games. Well, why do I care about video games? Well, because they're fun. They make me happy. Well, why do you care about happiness? Like, well, I just do. Like, it's just valuable. That has final or intrinsic value. That is something that is valuable. Happiness is valuable for its own sake, at least in this style of argument. And so the money that I have and the video games that I have, they're only instrumentally valuable relative to the happiness that I get. And so you can kind of figure out what sorts of things to plug in for your theory of value by sort of tracing this chain down. Now, this isn't the only way to figure out, what has final value, and there's lots of debate about if there even is such a thing, but this is, if we're going to have a theory of value, this is one sort of intuitive approach to getting there. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an actual example of a terrible, terrible consequentialist theory that I'm calling the pickle candle theory, or PCT. This is me making fun of my wife just a little bit. It's like, if you need to get her a gift for some occasion, pickles and candles, you really can't go wrong. I once convinced a Waffle House to sell me like an entire bag of their pickles because she loves Waffle House pickles, and I've never seen somebody so happy. So this is me poking fun at her a little bit. So that's going to be our theory of value. That's what we're going to care about, are pickles and candles. That's why I'm calling it the pickle candle theory. Our criterion of right, and we'll talk about what these all mean in a second, but basically we're going to try and bring about the best consequences. That's what we mean by maximizing here. And my decision procedure, aggregation, that's just a fancy word for adding. So I'll, add up the pickles and candles that I get and subtract the pickles and candles that I lose. Now, this is gonna be kind of funny. So I've got, here's my full-fledged sort of, here's what the pickle candle theory says. The right act is the one that seems like it would get you the most pickles or candles. Okay. We can even structure this as a full-on analysis. An act is right. Do you remember what IFF stands for? If and only if it would get you the most pickles or candles. Well, now we have an analysis of right action. This is something that we've learned how to engage with in Module 1, and I bet you can come up with a bunch of counterexamples to this analysis, right? Let's see what we can do here. So, here's our analysis. I bet you can get a counterexample for each direction, right? An act that, according to our pickle candle theory, would seem that is right, but that doesn't seem right. And then the reverse, an act that seems act that the pickle candle theory would say is wrong, but seems right. In other words, we're going to be able to get pickles and candles and right acts to come apart in both directions. So, here's some examples that we might come up with. I don't know, let's say I'm walking down the street and I see an old lady and she's carrying a jar of pickles, and I'm like, okay, well, the right act is the one that gets me the most pickles. So I brain her over the head and I steal her jar of pickles and I run away. Okay, I definitely got pickles out of that deal, but it does not seem intuitively morally correct, does it? Or what about an act that doesn't get me any pickles or candles? Let's say I save a baby from a burning building. I'm a hero, but I didn't get any pickles or candles in the process. Oh no, like I didn't maximize the good. So according to this pickle candle theory, I didn't do the right thing. So as an ethical theory, PCT, pickle candle theory, not very good. But at least we've got like a grounded example and something that we can like kind of sink our teeth into and engage with and sort of see how these consequentialist theories kind of work. Now PCT or pickle candle theory does fail. I think on every account it doesn't match up with our intuitions, right? It gets all of the cases kind of very, very wrong. It doesn't help us in any of the tricky cases, right? Euthanasia does not involve pickles. It's not as if, ending someone's life and they are like a piñata and they just blow up with pickles and candles or anything. Loads of counterexamples. Even the theory of value doesn't seem right. So we can do better. We can do better. And in fact, there are way better consequentialist theories. So let's start to kind of, though, narrow down a little bit what we're talking about here, because the variety of theories that fall under this consequentialist umbrella are huge, okay? And, different decision procedures, different theories of value, different criteria, right? They're going to get, different results here. So we might think about okay, well, whose outcome do we care about, right? So I care about, having a good or valuable outcome, but whose outcome am I concerned with? Maybe it's just my own. Maybe the right act is the one that maximizes or, does good consequences just for me. Or maybe what I care about are the right act that sort of maximizes or gets good consequences for me and people that are near me, that are close to me. Now, most consequentialist theories, and what we're just going to assume from now on, is that we're going to have agent-neutral theories. It doesn't matter who you're benefiting. What matters is just, better consequences for, humanity as a whole or whatever. Now, you might think that these are just kind of oh, who would be so selfish? It's not so much selfishness that would lead to a theory like this. Think about it this way. I'm in the best possible position to know what's going to benefit me, right? I know that if I, buy a video game for myself, I'm going to be super happy, but I don't know that about you. Maybe you don't like playing video games. And people close to me, I have a pretty good idea of, what's going to benefit them, because I'm close to them. I know what kind of stuff they care about. So there are reasons maybe to endorse views like this that aren't, nested in selfishness, but just sort of make it easier to define and figure out what the right act is. And that's okay. But for our purposes, we're going to stick with agent-neutral consequentialist theories. Doesn't matter who you're helping. And this is the standard view within consequentialism. How are we going to go about calculating these things? What's our decision procedure for figuring out, if we've done the right thing? For our purposes, we're going to stick with simple aggregation, add up the happiness and subtract the sadness kind of thing. But there's other ways of doing this that try to create more fairness for larger versus smaller groups, and they can get kind of complicated. And then, how demanding are we talking about here? Do we want to bring about the best possible consequences? Or do we just want to bring about good enough consequences? For our purposes, we're just going to focus on maximizing, okay? So we're trying to keep things simple. Now, the cool thing is pretty much everything that we say about this maximizing, aggregation, agent-neutral kind of consequentialism will apply, at least to some degree, to these other versions. So that's nice. So we're just trying to narrow down our focus a little bit without losing too much of the flavors that consequentialism can bring. Now, in particular, we're going to be looking at two very broad versions of consequentialism, act and rule. And they're both going to be maximizing consequentialist theories. The difference between these two, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time unpacking each of these, so don't stress right now trying to understand the differences. For act, what we're looking at is just sort of each individual act and trying to figure out, does this act bring about the best consequences? For rule consequentialism, what we're going to do is devise a set of rules that themselves are, if they were followed, I guess, would maximize the good. And then the right act is the one that matches up with those sets of rules. So a slightly different criterion of right, a different sort of decision procedure. We're going to evaluate each act versus we're going to come up with rules and then compare the act to the rules. We're going to talk about act first, okay? And what we're going to do also, because remember, so we need a criterion of right, a decision procedure, and a theory of value. Now, a lot of consequentialist theories will have some kind of welfarism. Welfarism is a really broad term for a lot of different theories of value. What we're going to do is just assume a view called hedonism. Now, hedonism is, and you might have heard of this and might think oh, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's not what we're talking about here. A hedonist kind of value theory is one that just identifies pleasure or happiness as the only thing that has intrinsic or final value. It's the only thing that's valuable for its own sake. And in a lot of cases, this sort of makes sense, right? If I sort of trace stuff that I care about, a lot of times at the end of that chain of stuff that I care about, the reason I care about it is because it makes me happy, right? So it's not a crazy idea. But again, so this is why, or how we're going to sort of narrow in our focus. So when you combine consequentialist criteria of right with welfarism as a theory of value, you get utilitarianism, a very, very famous, proper ethical view. And we are technically going to be looking at, if we go back just a little bit, we're going to be looking at act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Those are technically the two theories that we're going to be looking at, comparing, contrasting, seeing arguments for and against. We'll start with act utilitarianism and look at some of the arguments in favor of it, as well as some of the problems for it. I'll see you then.